This episode of the Deep Thinkers podcast is brought to you by Bright Island Outreach. Bright Island Outreach is a nonprofit organization that goes to the Dominican Republic multiple times a year, and they provide pro bono dental work for the impoverished people down there. Not only do they provide education on their teeth, but education on hygiene and things like that, but they also do fillings and extractions. They do root canals. They do cosmetics. They have mobile dental units, so they actually go into the little villages and help these people. You can actually check them out online at brightislandoutreach.org. You can see some of the pictures of what they're doing there. They're also on Instagram. They're on Facebook. Check them out there. You can donate at brightislandoutreach.org, or you can buy a t-shirt, or if you have an adventurous spirit, you can actually go down into the DR with them and provide some helping hands. There's always something for somebody to do. So if you are in the dental field, or if your spouse is in the dental field, the two of you can go. If you're married, the two of you can go together, because just because you're not in the dental field doesn't mean that they won't have something for you to do. Check them out, buy a t-shirt, and support the cause. This episode of the Deep Thinkers podcast is brought to you by Crandall Pest Control. Crandall Pest Control is a family-owned business that was founded in 2002. They do general pest control, rodents and weed control, but specialize in termites and scorpions. When you call them, mention the Deep Thinkers podcast and get $30 off your first general pest and scorpion treatment. Just 2 orders of business before I dive into this podcast. You'll have to forgive me. I kind of botched the intro. I left it in there so you can listen to it, but it's kind of funny. But here's a better one. Hunter Maats is a Harvard graduate, as well as the co-author with Katie O'Brien of the book The Straight A Conspiracy. I have not read it yet, but it's been on my list for a while now. I'm going to dive into it this week. He's also the co-host with Bryan Callen of a great podcast called Mixed Mental Arts. I highly recommend it. It's one I listen to. If you're not familiar with it, then check it out. Add it to your podcast rotation. If you are familiar with it, then you already know who Hunter is and what he's all about. Also, thank you for listening, Planet Earth. I love doing these podcasts, and I get stoked when I see that you're enjoying them also. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel. It's youtube.com/Jesse Noblesmith. And just click the red subscribe button. I'm currently at 122 subscribers, and that's awesome. Thank you all so much for subscribing. However, the game really starts at 1,000. So if you haven't yet subscribed, then please do. It may ask you to sign in. If you have a Gmail account, then you can log into YouTube with your Gmail address and Gmail password. Google owns YouTube, so that's how that works. Again, thank you all for listening. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share these videos if you feel the need. Hello, Planet Earth. I am here today with Harvard graduate and New York Times best-selling author Hunter Maats. How are you doing today, Hunter?
Well, I wish I was a New York Times best-selling author, but I'm certainly an author. Yeah, I don't know that we've hit the New York Times bestseller list, but I have a feeling that after this podcast, Jesse,
there's
going to blow the fuck up. We're going to be done. I mean, all of planet Earth is about to find out about this book, so that's really
Well, dozens of listeners across the globe now hear about this. I get a couple plays a month in Sweden, a couple plays a month in the Middle East. I've reached as far as India. Yeah. I mean, wow! I don't even know.
That's cool.
India. The Middle East is fine because I got a friend in Abu Dhabi. I expected that a little bit. Same with got a couple of friends in Sweden and England. So that makes sense. But like when a country pops up I've never even heard of or been to or have no connection to, that's when I'm like, oh yeah, man, just getting that reach out there.
Yep. And that's really the magic of podcasting and the magic of the internet is the ability to connect with people who have had similar experiences, even though we've never met, we live in totally different parts of the world. And, I stumbled into podcasting because Brian was friends with Joe and I was friends with Brian.
Right.
And so just sort of accidentally ended up podcasting 4 years ago. and really had no idea that anybody was listening. Like we weren't paying attention at all to like who was listening and where, and probably partly because I don't know how good the data was 4 or 5 years
Right.
ago.
Right.
But and then it's just been in the last 9 months, in particular since Rogan, I was like, there are all these people out here, and a lot of them seem to feel the same way that I do, have had a lot of the same experiences. Like, I honestly have more in common with those people than a lot of people who live within a 5 block radius of me.
Yeah, particularly in LA.
Yeah. Well, LA is, I mean, what I appreciate about LA is that it is a giant cultural vacuum in many senses.
Very,
Like,
very much so.
yeah, and the place that's really like the Gettys have two big museums out here in the Getty Center, which is up on this hill. It's this amazing piece of modern architecture, looks out over the whole of the city of LA. And I always think it's the perfect metaphor for LA because it is this beautiful facade, and then there's really not much inside.
Nice, nice. That's perfect. Yeah, during this last Oscar week, I got invited to live in LA, and my buddy lives in Beechwood Canyon and rents them out as Airbnb. I lasted 10 days, dude. I lasted 10 days. I was like, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah.
Oscar week, you cannot drive anywhere. And I'm living in this yoga studio just underneath down the hill from this mountain.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, man, an earthquake's going to happen. This yoga studio is going to slide down the hill. His mansion's going to land on me. And Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's going to be the only guy that can rescue me. Who knows where he is? He might be running for president, So,
Well, but the good thing is that if you've been doing yoga, then you'll be supple enough to be able
right.
to, deal with the falling house on you.
Not the case back then. Now I'm fit. I'm doing jujitsu. Back then I was fat. It was not good. But
Yeah, no, Dov Davidoff, Brian's buddy, has the best description of LA that I've ever heard, which he says that, being in LA is like swimming with dolphins, right? Like, Dov grew up in a junkyard and, was not around beautiful things. And then he moved out to LA and he's like, all the most beautiful women in the world. And he's like, it's like when you first get in with dolphins and they're like, you're swimming around and you're like, these are magical creatures. One of them brushed against my leg. This is so great. And then after 5 to 10 minutes, you're like, I'm fucking bored. Someone throw me a book.
Exactly.
Yeah. That really is the experience. But
yeah, I mean, there's awesome things to do in LA. It's a great place to visit. I'm sure unavoidably I'll spend time out there over the next year. But living there is, I've given it a couple tries. Back in my early 20s, I lived in Redondo Beach, and I lasted a year and a half in Redondo. Not a little bit longer than I lasted in Beechwood, but still, man, LA it's the belly of the beast, man. It's something else. It's a pressure cooker for sure.
Yeah.
I lived in Salt Lake for 7 years, and people always laugh when I say this, but Salt Lake is a lot like LA. Take away the size, the glam, and the edge, and there's so many Mormons in Salt Lake, and they all go across the world for their missions. A lot of them find wives, even though they say they don't. They do. A lot of them do. They bring them back. Sometimes they'll bring back family with those wives. So they got all kinds of restaurants, all kinds of different cultural pockets. You don't get a lot of diversity like that in Phoenix, where I'm at. Salt Lake is actually one of the best kept secrets in the United States. So it's a great party town. So if your travels take you there, definitely go.
Well, I've been to Salt Lake once, and just very, very briefly. But I think it is a fascinating place, culturally for a number of reasons. It's also that when people detribalize from Mormonism, they detribalize hard, and they, just like they're like, I know what I don't want.
Right.
Like, time to get tatted up, get my face pierced. And get really into third wave coffee.
Yeah, there's a lot of coffee shops there in Salt Lake. I actually, in a former podcast, I talk about getting arrested in Salt Lake, and I got arrested in front of my favorite coffee shop, Badass Coffee. right there on State Street, like right down the main drag, the one that if
Yeah.
you're driving north, it lands you right into the temple,
Hmm.
right there. So they don't like weed in Salt Lake yet. They're not quite
It turns
around
out.
yet. So this is
Well,
in
it's easy to,
2008.
especially, yeah, especially when you're high, it's easy to confuse Colorado and Utah. Like they're so
Yeah,
close.
one's a little more Mormon and less organic, and one's a little more organic and less Mormon. So, but
But mountains. They both have
they
mountains,
both
you
have
know.
mountains. They both love to ski. They both love to hunt. You
Yeah.
know, the cultures are pretty similar there. Aside from the Mormon element, really just kind of it would be the same place without that. So, but
Yeah.
I first heard of you when you were on the Joe Rogan. No. I first heard of you before that when we were actually talking before you were on the Rogan podcast.
Yep.
I first heard about you on Mixed Mental Arts. Now, Bryan Callen, let's talk about Bryan for a minute. Some of my listeners won't know who Bryan is, but Bryan,
Which is already a problem
yeah,
because Brian is
that's your first
greatest.
mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, your first mistake is not knowing about Bryan Callen because he's the greatest actor who
Actor
has ever
alive.
lived.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Built for dancing, among other things.
And power fucking.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't forget that. Oh my gosh. Now, Bryan has no idea who I am, but every time he comes to Arizona, the last couple of times, I'll show up and be like, "Hey, dude, remember me? You're the one that inspired me to get into stand up." And he's like, "Yeah, dude, I totally remember you." He doesn't, but he's always super cool. Always super cool. Um, but yeah, I was listening to an episode of Joe Rogan, and he was on there, and he was like, and they were talking about people that should just do stand up. If you wanted to try it, then do it. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds encouraging. And then Bryan was like, listen, when you were in school, if you grew up and the teacher would set up a joke and you knew there would be consequences if you shut down that punchline, but you had to do it anyway, then you're a comic and you need to do stand up. And I was like, that was a story of my life, man. Like any teacher that I didn't get
Wow.
along with, I would just sit there and wait for them to say something. I'd be like, and totally derail the class. But if I liked the teacher, I would do it a little less often. So, but yeah, so you're Bryan's co-host with Mixed Mental Arts, and that's a great podcast. Anybody that's not listening to Mixed Mental Arts, if you want to get that brain churning early in the morning or whenever you listen to podcasts, that's a good one. As I was listening to you on Mixed Mental Arts, I was like, man, I could have this guy on my podcast like 15, 20 times. This would be awesome. Let's talk a little bit about culture. A lot of the things you've said on both shows have been pretty interesting about culture. Now, what is it actually that you studied at Harvard as we dive into this?
I studied biochemistry,
Okay.
and there's an old Carol Dweck who's a big psychologist at Stanford. Shared this joke. It's an old joke in academia that it's not research, it's me search. And inevitably, like if you're going to spend 40, 50 years of your life studying one problem, it's because on some level it was deeply emotionally impactful to you,
Right.
and like some shit happened to you and you're like, this is the hugest deal ever, I need to figure this out.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing for me with culture in the sense that Bryan and I had this similar childhood. Bryan's dad was actually my dad's boss at Citibank, and the first house that I went to after being born was the Callen house. So
Right.
I've literally known, I mean, minus a few hours or days, like I have known Bryan Callen for my entire life.
That's how it is with me and Kevin Lee, one of my guests that comes on here all the time. He's a Hollywood producer, but yeah, we've known each
Mhm.
other our whole lives, man. That's cool that you have someone that you've known that long.
Yeah, and when you've had that experience, it's like, decades go by, you don't see each other, but it's just grounded in a whole different, I mean, it's just a much more solid thing. So, um, and the Bryan, has beautifully summed up what our childhood was that we saw great poverty from inside an air-conditioned car. And that was really, you're driving around in this little like cozy first world privileged bubble, and then but you're like literally going through the slums of Rio or the slums of India,
Yes,
or
you've lived a lot
you're
of cool
suddenly,
places.
yeah. And Brian too. I mean, if you combine our country count, I mean, there's pretty much not a region that we didn't grow up
Right.
in.
Right.
Um, there is that time that Brian spent in Antarctica that he doesn't usually like to talk about. As a child, that's where he really honed his sort of tough fighting skills. He was just
Antarctica.
Big Mike released him. No, I'm joking. But if I was really going to build the legend of Bryan Callen, it was like Brian, age 12, was placed at the South Pole and told to find his way back to
Waiting for them
civilization.
at the airport when they got home.
um,
Love it.
but so yeah, so we grew up in all these different places, and we coped in different ways. I mean, Brian's thing, it was always sports and comedy, because those were the sort of the real commonalities. Like if you could make people laugh, then you instantly were able to make friends.
Right.
And then sports obviously is a great way to connect. And Brian's whole thing is really born out of that. Like he's so good at he's like, dude, you work out? Like, oh my God, you're like really amazing. And these are all coping strategies that came from that childhood. Um, so for me, though, I was just sort of lost and confused because the rules kept on changing in ways that I didn't understand. So, you're hanging out in Brazil. I mean, this is sort of a great story. So, I the first language I spoke was Brazilian Portuguese.
Nice.
Lived in Brazil for 3, 4 years, and then we moved to New York. And the thing in New York was like everybody wants to get their kids into the best kindergarten because that's the retarded culture of New York.
Heard it's
Yeah,
crazy. There's
it's pretty
waiting
nuts.
lists and application processes
Hmm.
just for kindergarten.
Yep.
Nuts.
And so my dad wants to get me into one of these fancy kindergartens because that's the game and all the city bankers are doing it and all that. So we show up to the first one. And yeah, they put me in the little outfit with the little blazer and the tie and the shirt and all that sort of stuff. And about 15, 20 minutes into the interview, I'm like, it's time to get naked. And so I literally stripped off all my clothes in
Yes.
the middle of the interview, which was totally okay in Brazil. Like we just got
Yeah.
naked all the time. But apparently, this made me a bad cultural fit for this fancy kindergarten.
Maybe. In your
Uh,
defense, I've done that recently. I mean,
I'd still do it. Let's do it now, Jesse.
you know,
Um,
nothing's quite as comfortable. It's how I
yeah,
sleep.
as naked.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So,
Frankly, I find loincloths restrictive.
yeah,
Um,
right. Clean glass.
um,
It's about the least
but
restrictive
so,
clothing on the planet. There.
still, it's too restrictive for me.
There you go.
Um,
That's a great story.
but yeah, but so I mean, that's sort of like my childhood in microcosm, where it's just constantly, I think I know the rules, and then suddenly, oh, apparently these aren't the rules
No,
anymore,
no one told.
and nobody told me.
Pretty funny.
And so I've always been trying to figure out, this question of, there's our shared humanity, right? Like
Right.
supposedly we're all the same in some ways, but at the same time there are these profound cultural differences. And so trying to sort of sort through and figure out that puzzle. And, at first I was like, I know where the answer is, science, because, in my culture, that was where you turned to for truth, for answers, for all that sort of stuff. And so I went down that rabbit hole. That's, why I went to Harvard, because was like, if the answers are anywhere, they're there. And then majored in biochemistry, and then, was disappointed by academia, because, it is a culture that they're just so focused on their little tiny problem,
Hmm.
that they've sort of lost all perspective on why do we study these things? Oh, it's to help people. It's to help people make better decisions and have better lives and all of that. And then just basically, moved out here, started tutoring to pay my bills, and just started reading everything I could to try and make sense of things. And I didn't even really understand that was the question that I was trying to answer.
Hmm.
Um, I just was like, trying to make sense of the world. Um, and then had the great fortune to know Bryan Callen, which is the greatest fortune that any man can have.
And
Um,
I've only met him briefly a couple times, and I have to agree.
but even just that small exposure afterwards, like he was so radiant that you actually got a free tan.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Well, the first time Brennan Schaub was there too with him, so like it was two giant pillars of heat, you know. So
well, one of them is a giant pillar. One of them wishes that he was giant and built like a pillar.
Brennan Schaub, Brandon will catch up to Brian one of these days. Just joking.
Um, so anyway, Brian had this podcast, Man Thoughts. That
I remember him getting clowned,
yeah.
but I thought it was good.
And then he changed. Well, it was what it was, and then he changed it to the Bryan Callen Show because of Joe Rogan, and then Brian and I would always talk about books, and so we just started. I was like, Brian, like because you're kind of famous, like you actually get pretty good download numbers on this. Like if I lie about them a bit, then we can really get a lot of these people whose books that we've been reading on the show. And so we started getting all these people on, and then 200 interviews in, it just became very clear that a lot of these academics had never ever heard of anything else that anybody was doing.
Wow.
And so we decided, I mean, again, like here's where we were lucky. Brian, was obviously because of Joe and that whole community super into mixed martial arts. And so we were like, okay, what would we call a podcast that puts all these ideas together into a single worldview? Mixed martial arts.
Yeah, I saw the name of that. I was like, dang, that's a good one. That's a good name for a podcast. So,
and I mean, obviously I know you do a lot of jujitsu.
yeah, passion.
And it's the same thing, there are academics, they have one thinking style, there's an orthodoxy, they do their thing, but you put them up against a different way of thinking and suddenly like their skills collapse, they have no gain. And so the point is just that, mixed martial arts is the perfect metaphor, where you're putting all these different thinking styles together and ultimately you're trying to evolve one that's more powerful than anything that we've seen before.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you're not worried about who wins or loses a particular bout, because the exciting thing about mixed martial arts is what has happened to the art form over the course of a decade.
Right.
Like how much better it is. It's the sport that wins. And we can get individually caught up in a particular bout, but it's really about the sport that wins. And the big thing for mixed mental arts, like what the core sort of frameworks have become, is really it's one thing, which is cultural evolution. And that's the big.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Such an interesting.
Yeah. And essentially, just to break it down for your listeners, it's cultural evolution works in very much the same way as genetic evolution. So people obviously see that there are cultural differences, and they see that some cultures don't seem to be particularly well suited to the modern world, and then they try and say, oh, that culture's bad or that culture's good, and then people get social justice warriors get super upset, they get their hackles up. And the key thing is that you can, in order to talk about something, it's really about being well adapted to a particular environment, right? So I can't say that a dolphin is better than a dog, but the second that I define the environment, now I can, right? So is a dolphin or a dog better adapted to living in the middle of the ocean? Well, now that we've defined the environment, obviously the dolphin is better adapted. And it's the same thing with culture. Which culture is better adapted to the Amazon rainforest? The culture of, say, the Yanomamo tribe, or the culture of
NFL
a bunch of LA hipsters? Yeah, exactly. Like, who's gonna do better?
Right. I'm not putting any money on the hipsters.
No. And in fact, European explorers, when they went to the Amazon, when they went to the desert, when they went to the Arctic, overwhelmingly they did one thing, which is that they died. And if we
Yeah.
did take Bryan Callen, age 12, and put him at the South Pole, he would fucking die.
Yeah.
Like he may not think he would fucking die, but he would fucking die. And
Yeah.
it's important to realize that it's not necessarily that he would die because that environment is so inhospitable. Like there are so many stories of European explorers, like, they've managed to get their ships stuck in the ice. They're fucking starving to death.
Yeah.
They're literally having to resort to cannibalism. And then,
Yeah.
these Inuit walk by and they're like, why are you so hungry? Do you want some seal? I just caught it over there. But the technologies required to catch a seal are incredibly complicated, right? You have to, how to drill a hole in the ice, how to watch, how to spot, how to observe.
Right.
There are these technologies like the toggle harpoon, which is something that I only just learned about pretty recently, but it's
I've
fucking awesome.
never heard of a toggle harpoon.
Oh yeah, it's pretty cool. So basically what it is you have, your regular harpoon, but then
Right.
the toggle harpoon basically has this detachable part on the front. So what happens is it goes in, the toggle detaches, gets trapped underneath the skin.
Uh-huh.
And so then what happens is that when you try and pull the harpoon out, you're not going to like just straight up pull the blade out.
Mm-hmm.
It's trapped under, so now you're pulling against the whole skin.
Oh, so you can kind
So
of
you
pull
have
a little more. Yeah. Very cool.
um, and other things too, like they had the bladder harpoon, where basically there's like a giant balloon on it, so that the harpoon floats, so it can't get away. So
Okay.
they've figured out like these cultures evolve. Like if you spend all day hunting seals for many, 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 many generations, you figure out some shit about
Yeah,
how
that's
to
what we
hunt
get good at.
seals.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so these cultures have evolved all sorts of crazy stuff. The other great one that I love is from the Amazon. There's a story in The Lost City of Z, which they just released as a movie, but in the book, so Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett, who's the European explorer, sees the Guarayo, who are this local tribe, and basically Guarayo man picks out this plant, right? Which if you and I walk around the Amazon, it's just like, oh, fucking plants.
Yeah,
They're
there's
all fucking plants.
everywhere.
Yeah. But you're not like, oh, the blah blah blah
There's
plant, which is
loads of them.
yeah, there's just lots of plants. It's green as shit here. Um, but so he takes this plant, he squeezes it, and then it releases this fluid into the river, and basically it turns the river milky, and then all these fish float to the surface upside down, and
Nice.
this little boy goes in and he plucks out the fattest fish, and then the cloud dissipates, and the other ones, which are just being stunned, swim away.
Nice.
So it's this amazing thing. But how the fuck does your culture figure that out over generations and generations? And then ultimately, you're not, if you're Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett, you're not going to wander in there and be like, yes, that plant, I will do
Right.
da 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 da, right?
Well, in a way, how that
So
tribe is doing that is observation and notes, whether it's mental or actually written down, which is essentially science, observation and
that's right.
so. I mean, I call it primitive science. They don't know it's science, but they know that they're taking note of what works and what doesn't, and they're building off of what works. So, but continue, yeah,
Well, but I think that really raises a good question: is this distinction between primitive science and modern science?
right,
Like, what is the difference? Because if you look at the scientific method, it's what humans do already. So
right,
science is really just a formalization of what humans already do, so that we're just much more conscious about taking observation. We're much more conscious about reflecting on what we believe,
much more
so that we can do
as
better.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I try
Yep.
to explain
But
the concept to people of like we built houses, like we learned how to stack bricks based on observation and notes. That's science.
Mhm.
But anyway, I love what you said there about the tribe just knowing exactly what to do because through generations they've been taught that by people who, through trial and error, figured it out. So Very cool.
Yeah, and in the same way that we're sort of, we can often be impressed by the achievements of genetic evolution, right? Like
Hmm.
genetic evolution evolves these incredible structures,
Right.
the bird's wing, right, is super impressive, or the eye is super impressive,
Right.
or, all these different things. Cultural evolution evolves these incredibly sophisticated solutions over generations and what tends to happen is that the problem is that when cultures encounter each other, they very often come in and they're like, this shit makes no sense to me. And
Destroy
so
it.
this was the yeah, destroy it. Fuck this, savages. What do the fucking savages know? Um, and so, the one of the great examples of that is nixtamalization of corn. Um, so the nixtamalization, right? The tamal bit of nixtamalization is the same as tamale, because the Aztecs, when they would grind up their corn, they would put in burnt wood ash and burnt seashells, right? So they're like putting like ashes and burnt seashells into their food. And so obviously the Europeans come in and they're like, that's weird as shit. There's no fucking way I'm putting fucking wood ash in my fucking food, right? I'm not eating seashells with my corn. So they're like, thanks for the corns, dude. Gonna leave the wood ash and the seashells out. And they then spread corn all across Europe, and suddenly this disease appears called pellagra. And pellagra is a huge problem for hundreds of years throughout the American South, throughout Russia, throughout Spain. And it turns out that hundreds of years later, we realize that pellagra is vitamin deficiency, and that niacin, the B vitamin, is actually in corn, but it's not bioavailable. And you need to alkalize the corn with something like wood ash or burnt seashells in order to release it.
Yeah.
Now, bing! Now, obviously, the Aztecs don't understand this conceptually. Like, they don't know about vitamins, they don't know about alkali, they don't know about pH. But the point is that cultural evolution is so powerful that it slowly, incrementally evolved these solutions that are way smarter than individual humans. And so, a lot of the sort of the big summary of this is Jenny Aguilar, who's one of the people in the mixed martial arts community, came up with this great summary of what this all means, which is feisty. Face it, evolution is smarter than you.
I like it.
And so, yeah, and so you have to, it doesn't mean that you should be passive in the face of evolution. You should be feisty about it. And in essence, what part of what excites me is that the community, the podcast community, is feisty as fuck,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Yeah. It's
and,
you have to be to
and
make it in the podcast community. Yeah.
yep.
You have to have that tenacity for sure.
And I mean, even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is about being feisty, right? You have your constraints, and then how within those constraints do you achieve the result that you want?
Absolutely.
Um,
You have to, yeah,
yeah.
you have to find a technique that works within where you're confined to. So,
Hmm.
absolutely. So, um, you mentioned something on the Joe Rogan podcast the first time you were on. Have you been on more than once? I switched back and forth between podcasts for a couple months and then music for a couple months. So I'm always like 1 to 4 months behind on podcasts. And in fact, like we were talking, you were on Rogan. It took me a month before I listened to it, and then I was like, "Oh, by the way, great podcast, man." So, but yeah, you were talking about the Scotch Irish heritage, how it came out of the Civil War. Let's talk a little bit about that because it was super fascinating. And then you guys kind of had to move on from that topic, and I was like, "No, go back." But let's start with the Civil War and where the Scotch Irish heritage, what it's all about and where it came from, how it got to the United States. So,
Well, it goes further back than that, right? So the Scotch Irish, grew up in this environment of herding, right? That's how they made their living, herding sheep in the Scottish Highlands. And if you look at herding cultures around the world, right,
mhm,
they evolve very, very similar cultures. So the Arabs, the Mongols, the Comanche Indians, And it's because herders have a very specific problem, right? Which is essentially property rights. So
From
if
my
you
sheep.
have exactly, see, the point is, you know this shit. You know this shit. Like your culture has taught it. You got that amazing big red beard, and I'm just like,
Exactly.
fucking you and William Wallace need to go fuck some English people up. Um, um,
I actually have a tattoo of Fionn McCool on my leg. Not quite done yet, but it's a leg sleeve. So
that's amazing.
I wanted it. Here, I'll just show it to you real quick over the camera. I wanted an
Yeah,
Irish tattoo, and I wanted something that
yeah.
wasn't like a Celtic knot. So
Oh, fuck me.
there he is, right there. Yeah, I still got to fill in the leprechaun. And that's him as a kid, and then that's him as a grown
Dude,
man
that's
right
fucking
there.
epic.
So yeah, still got to finish
That's
that part right
amazing.
there. But yeah, that's John Hanson, a Black Lotus tattoo here in Arizona. So if you're ever in the
Wow.
market for some ink, you got to hit my boy up.
All right, well that sounds good. That sounds good.
But yeah,
Well,
no,
I appreciate, that you're representing the McCool. I mean, that's a great epic fucking story.
man, I wanted something that wasn't just a surface Celtic knot, and I went on my mission,
Hmm.
my Mormon mission to England and Wales, which
Hmm.
was well, you're from England originally, aren't you? Wasn't isn't you say vitamins and you talk like a Brit, even though you don't have the accent. So and I know you spent some time over there, but my mission was from Aberystwyth in Wales all the way over to
Hmm.
Malvern down to Plymouth, and it was
Hmm.
the West Country and parts of Wales. Um, and I had a companion that was from Limerick, Ireland, and we were talking about
Hmm.
mythology and culture. And I was like, "Oh yeah, we got mythology in America. Yeah, for sure. We got like Paul Bunyan and all this stuff, Pecos Bill." And he just goes, he like started laughing at me, like mythology. Yeah, what is it? 50 years old? Yeah, mythology. Okay.
Yeah,
He's like, listen, let me
yeah.
tell you about Fionn McCool. And he started telling me the story about when Fionn was a baby, and the giant came to his house and stuff. And I'm like, man, I've heard this story before. And I'd actually heard the story in like third grade. I had a teacher that was super into
Hmm.
reading and found this, maybe it was fourth grade, but found this story for me. And so later on, when I wanted to get an Irish tattoo, I was like, man, I'm not going to get some shallow Celtic knot. No offense to anybody that has Celtic weaves or knots. I just wanted something a little bit more deep, like my personality. And I remembered the story of Fionn McCool, and I was like, that's it. There we go. There's some great pictures of him out there. Well, at least drawings. He's a little old for cameras, but yeah. So anyway, go ahead. I didn't mean to derail you and interrupt you there again.
No,
So
no, no. But the point is that one of the key features of honor cultures is they're great storytellers. I mean, the Irish are famous for the gift of the gab, and yeah, exactly. They tell these epic stories, and this is also part of that honor culture because in terms of getting people to stay off my land, right?
exactly.
Well, how do you do that? Well, it's partly that you sort of build up your reputation so that everybody is like, oh man, don't fuck with Jesse Smith. Jesse Smith is not the guy you want to fuck with.
If
And
only.
then if well, yeah, that you get now you got the McCool tattoo. I mean, I think that's the thing. You may find people are like, "Fuck, he killed a giant as a baby." Uh, so, but they and also there's this aggressive use of violence. So that violence is basically so that everybody knows you fuck with his sheep, you fuck with his women, you're gonna fucking die, and you're not only gonna fucking die, you're gonna die in a very unpleasant way.
Yeah.
And so in Black Rednecks, White Liberals, Thomas Sowell talks about how they used to have these fights in the American South that were, I think they were called rough and ready, right?
Mm.
And basically, these two guys would get into a ring, and then the community would be around them, and then they would say, do you want to fight rough or do you want to fight, or whatever it was. Like you had these two different ways of fighting, and basically one version was no holds barred.
Yeah.
And when they meant no holds barred, they meant no holds barred, right?
Yeah.
Eye gouging,
Fighting.
testicle ripping, fighting, all of that sort of stuff. And, because people were so invested in that, you would find that they would fight until, they were mutilated, had lost their eyes, had lost their testicles, had lost
Yeah.
all of this sort of stuff, and they would still be going.
That's cool, man. Yeah.
Yep.
And Dana White had a hard enough time getting the UFC licensed. Rough and ready fighting doesn't have a prayer in today's modern society.
Nope. Nope. And so these sorts of, this experience of herding, because I mean, this was how people made their living, how they survived. The Sicilians, by the way, are also another honor culture, right?
Right.
And so Bryan and I, a few years ago, at some point, Bryan started going on this like thing about like, if somebody touches fucks with my family, I fucking kill them. Like, da da da. He goes on all this sort of stuff, and I said, where Bryan Callen doesn't come from. And, Bryan is not from Sicily, but his mother is Sicilian. And, a lot of those cultural values were transmitted over the course of generations, long past when they were no longer living in Sicily and when they were living in New York. And that's how powerful culture is that, even though we're no longer sheep herders with the Scots Irish, or even though, the majority of Arabs are no longer herding camels or whatever it may be, a lot of those intuitions around violence, around honor, around trespassing still exist. And Richard Nisbett, who we've had on Mixed Mental Arts multiple times, wrote this book called A Culture of Honor. And it's actually, I love Richard's backstory as well. I think it's fantastic. So Richard grew up in Texas. He's a Texan. And then he moved north. Was he?
I was born in Dallas, but
oh, you were?
Yeah, I adopted at 3 months old and brought to Phoenix. But I was actually quick side note. This last year, I met my biological mother and half sister out in Dallas. A friend of mine and I tracked him down, went out there and met him. But definitely understand. I could see where the Scotch Irish culture is still alive and well in Texas. So.
Yep. Well, and that whole "don't mess with Texas" thing, that is the.
Yeah, my biological mother has that hanging from her. The Texas state with "Don't mess with Texas" is hanging from her rearview mirror. So.
Yep.
But go ahead. I'll. Well, side note: if I'm ever cutting you off, just feel free to keep talking and I'll shut up. So it's all good.
No. The point of this is to have a conversation. I mean, that's what's great about the internet is that, two random dudes who have never met each other can like talk on Twitter and then set up a time to podcast and then,
awesome.
Yeah. And like, I mean, part of the reason why we moved it towards mixed mental arts is because, sort of the traditional broadcast media intuitions, right? Is that like, we get publishers send us books, and in the book there's like this neat little talking points thing of like, these are the important talking points, so you don't actually have to read the book. And then, the author comes on and then proceeds to repeat all the things you just read on that piece of paper. And It's fucking dumb.
Super.
Yeah. And all the interviews end up being the same. If you've heard one of them, you've heard all of them.
And then why would you read the book after that when you've heard the key points they're trying to get across,
Yep.
So.
So I think part of what's great about podcasting is that we don't just spiel each other. Like, I'm trying to give your listeners basically like the key beats so that they can take away the story without having to read the books. But the point is, yeah, absolutely. If I'm ever cutting you off, you fucking shut me down like the Scotch Irish,
Actually,
Finn McCool is shit.
Yeah, dude. This beard would be down to here, but when I went to Texas, I figured it was a big important thing, so I shaved it off, getting all clean cut, for the introduction, knowing full well I was going to grow it out again. So it's just back where it was before I shaved it. Mm-hmm. So this next year of growth should lead me to new and exciting places as far as the beard is concerned. So
I'm excited. I'm excited. that beard and that Finn McCool tattoo.
There we go, man. There we go, man. I got some Irish street credit going on. There's some Scotch Irish
Yep.
street credit, but yeah, it'll be interesting, man. The beard is on my logo, as you've probably seen of me doing the.
Mhm.
But it'll be and as the beard gets longer, I may have to have the logo redrawn to reflect the actual growth of the beard. It'll be true to the fan base. So, but
Well, absolutely. Um, and yeah, and I mean, the thing is, we could probably just like doodle on at the end,
yeah,
just
it's like
like
another
add
layer.
in layers of beard.
Copy it, move
Yeah,
it down. Copy it, move it down. Is it gross?
like the rings on a tree. How old is
Exactly.
Jesse Smith?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You'll be able to tell when you won't have to look at the number on the logo. You can just actually tell by the length of the beard, how old it is. So, but
Um, but, but yeah, so Richard Nisbet, he's from Texas, and then he moves north to, go into academia and go to northern universities, and is just shocked by the cultural differences. He, is like, everybody up here is so fucking rude. He wouldn't say fucking, but,
right,
everybody here is so rude. And he's in academia, and then in the 90s, when there's a lot of political correctness going on,
liberals
he
also.
wanted to study culture. Yeah. And so he wanted to study culture, but knew that as a white man from the South, that in general, he wasn't going to be able to study really any cultures, except for, he was like, I know one culture I can study and speak honestly about, and that's white Southern culture. And specifically because he knew that any study of culture would have to involve some sort of critique. And so he basically focused on the fact that in the South and in the North, there are two very different patterns of the types of murders that are committed. In the North, you get a lot of what are called instrumental murders. These are 7-Eleven murders, people trying to get paid. And so, they hold up a convenience store and then they get shot because it turns out the clerk is packing. And then in the South, you get a lot of honor killings. So these are based around lovers' triangles, people trespassing, things like that. And in fact, until 1970 in Texas, if you caught your wife in bed with another man and you killed him, it was considered justifiable homicide. Yep. And so he basically, picks apart, like, why is this? And that, it all basically comes down to this old Scotch Irish culture and these old intuitions. And then the other sort of really interesting wrinkle with this is the fact that, Thomas Sowell, I mentioned earlier, who wrote this book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals, is that there's always been this narrative of, did the Africans who were enslaved and brought to the United States, did they preserve their authentic African culture, which sometimes you hear, that sort of narrative of like Ebonics is like, African speech patterns or whatever, or were they robbed of their culture?
right,
It turns out that overwhelmingly they were robbed of their culture. Like some elements were preserved, but that they ended up blindly copying a lot of the culture of their oppressors, namely that white redneck culture. And if you look at ghetto black culture, it's black redneck culture. It's the
right,
same thing. They eat a lot of the same food. They go to church. They like the same kinds of music. And then on top of that, they have this strong thing about don't diss me, don't
right.
disrespect me, right? They're obsessed with honor and reputation, aggressive use of violence to let everybody know so that your name rings out. So you don't have to like look that hard once you put the white redneck culture and the black redneck culture against each other to realize they're essentially the same culture.
Yeah.
Um,
Real quick, let's talk about Ebonics for a second in the culture or the where Ebonics comes from. Because when you said that before, that was like a lightning bolt. Because I've lived in Cornwall and I've lived in Plymouth. Go ahead. Like you know more about it than I do.
So yeah, so the one of the interesting things is that this idea that Ebonics is somehow African. The point is, if you talk to any linguist or you look at any of the literature, you'll find out no, it's not. It actually overwhelmingly comes from places like the west of England, and so one of the most prominent features in African American vernacular English, Ebonics, is, I be doing this, right? I be eaten, I be whatever, right? And rather than I am, right? And that's a feature that anybody who's spent time in the west of England, places like Cornwall, will recognize with a
Totally.
slight phonetic change. We be doing that, and you be doing that, and we be doing that.
I can't
And
I can't
so,
write, but that don't really matter because I come from the West
yeah,
Country. I can drive a tractor. So
yeah. And with small changes, the point is that it's really, you get distracted by the phonetics, right? The sounds of the vowels and a few other
right.
things. But a lot of the grammar and the syntax is the same as that Cornish West of England speech. And so the point is that you know there's often, and this is Thomas Sowell's whole thing, is the whole idea of black pride, right?
Right.
Well, firstly, Sowell makes a great point, which is, when was pride ever a good thing, right? Like, pride is
Yeah, it's got
notoriously,
people in a lot of trouble.
yeah, pride goes before a fall, hubris, right? I mean, the ancient Greeks were like, hubris leads to nemesis, right?
Right.
So, you get all arrogant, you get high on yourself, and then you get cut down. Um, and so, but part of it is that pride is basically thinking that you have it all figured out.
Mhm.
And so, the real problem of a lot of this identity politics is that it's about, creating pride, defensiveness. I know it all. This is the way. This is my people's culture. You don't get to talk about it. And so, rather than having cultural exchange or us learning from each other, it actually shuts down those lines of communication. And a lot of that black pride has rested on this myth that somehow black culture is this authentic African thing that is being preserved and passed down for generations to generations, and it's just not.
Yeah.
There are obviously elements that were preserved and elements that were passed down and elements that were woven in, particularly into the music, and some of the cuisine and some of the religious practices. But the honor culture elements are not. That's not something you find in West Africa. And if the great example that Sowell uses is, he puts side by side West Indian culture, so essentially people from the Caribbean, and then people from the American South. Now, obviously, if you look at skin color, both dark skinned, they have high melanin content in their skin.
Right.
If you look at the slave experience, they both had the slave experience, but they actually have totally different cultures and totally different sets of outcomes. So when you look at a lot of successful African Americans, people like Colin Powell, they're overwhelmingly West Indian, because they have very different intuitions around education. Crucially, J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy, which is very much about that Scotch Irish culture, that Appalachian culture.
I'm taking notes of
Um,
these books that you're suggesting.
I'll send a list of what those
Okay,
books
cool.
are, because there's basically like a core set of there's sort of like big framework books like Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success that sort of lay out how does cultural evolution work, and that stuff
Okay.
about nixtamalization, that was all from there. And then there are these very specific books about specific elements or dimensions of culture, like the honor culture,
Mhm.
which is Culture of Honor by Richard Nisbett, Black Rednecks, White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, Born Fighting, which is all about the Scots Irish, which is another classic one by Jim Webb, which I think you would find really interesting. But I'll send you a list of these, and
Cool.
you can put them in the show notes, or in general, as Jesse will tell you, I am very accessible on Twitter, or
Absolutely.
on the Mixed Metal Art Facebook group. And so if you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me.
Sounds
But so, as J.D. Vance in this book, Hillbilly Elegy, talks about his own experience of sort of dealing with this cultural baggage. And, just remembers, thinking school and learning were for sissies, they were for girls. And obviously, if you're like, oh, wait a minute, so I am going to be this thing I don't want to be if I learn, then you're not going to learn.
right.
And those intuitions again come out of hurting. because, I've got a friend who's from Alabama, who also has been reading all these books and loves this stuff. Dave Callen, which his last name just always, it's literally Callen.
I had a funny little story about that name. I had one of my sisters dated a guy named Colin, and when he or when she was telling me about him, she goes, "Yeah, colon like the body part," and I was like, "Do you know what body part the colon is?" And yeah, and I explained it to her. She's like, "I can't wait to see him next," So
Yeah.
I was like, because that's how he would introduce it. Like, yeah, colon like the body part. And I'd be like, you couldn't say like colon like the punctuation mark. Like you had body part. Like that's the association you want people to have. Okay, cool.
That's gold. Also, by the way, if there was ever a case where I think that we could all unify behind the idea that women should keep their maiden name, that's the situation.
Yeah, like, no arguments. Even the most misogynistic guy is not going to argue on that. Like,
you must be called Colin.
Yeah, sister, you won. I throw the talent on that one. I wouldn't take it either. So.
No, but Dave's at Second City, which is one of the big improv places out here. He teaches. He's very funny, and his whole thing is like, book learning doesn't make your sheep fuck faster. And so, if you're sitting on a hillside and you're watching sheep, or you're sitting in the desert and you're watching your camels, or you're watching your horses as a Mongol, right? There's literally, like, you reading, putting your eyes on a book would take your eyes off your sheep. Now the wolves come in, whatever comes in. So it's the last thing you want to do. So these intuitions around learning are that learning is a waste of time, right? It's not going to pay off. And in those historical environments, it was a waste of time, but it's not the environment that we live in anymore.
Right.
And so those cultural intuitions need to change. But the problem is that this idea of, Black pride, or pride in general, right? Redneck pride, it doesn't really matter, what the pride is, prevents us from changing those intuitions, because we're now it's a question of identity, where it's like, how the fuck dare you, blah, blah. And all of that is very understandable. Right. But ultimately, if you've got to make a choice between being defensive of a culture that you didn't evolve and you didn't create, and that evolved for a different environment, and getting paid and getting laid. So, what's going to serve you more? And our whole point with mixed mental arts is, if you lay this out for people so that people understand this, then some number of them will be like, you know what, I have one life, and I'm going to get paid and get laid. And, and what will happen is then the conversation will really start to shift, because 50% of people will have been like, listen, like, none of the cultures that we have today are well adapted to the environment of constant technological change, the internet, all of that sort of stuff. Right. So kind of the playing field has been reset. We all are massively out of our depth here, and we all sort of have to evolve and figure out a new culture. And then 50% will be like, no, my culture is correct. How dare you? You don't know the experience of my people. And, they'll just come to seem increasingly ridiculous. Yeah. Because they are.
Yeah. No, it's interesting the way you say that, how humanity evolves, but the culture doesn't. Or if it does, it evolves super slowly. I mean, we can look at technology like the telephone. When the telephone was first implemented, the switchboard operators were all like 13-year-old boys, and they were rude to people. Mm-hmm. They swore all the time. They hung up on people. After a while, we figured out, well, hey, that's not really the way you want to treat a customer that's paying for a phone service. Maybe we should up that game. I feel like humanity is experiencing a similar cultural upheaval with social media. We've had social media. We've only had the internet for 20 plus years, readily available. We'll say 20 years to keep the math even. Social media has been around for half that. So, I mean, you still have people that are airing the most personal aspects of their life on social media. You have people getting in huge fights. I got called a racist the other day by a total stranger. I was like, oh, really? Explain to me how me posting an article explaining how the Las Vegas shooter wasn't a conspiracy theory. Explain to me how that makes me a racist. I'm dying to know. But I mean, yeah, you get people taking pictures of their food and putting it on social media. You know, guys sending pictures of their junk to girls. Like, we have no idea as a society what to do with this powerful new technology. So we're like, everything, let's put everything out there. Um, is that an observation of me just being weird, or can you see a little? Is there some method to that madness? Maybe. I mean, because to me it seems like a big mess right now. It's going to take us another 10, 15 years to sort out, and then we won't even use Facebook anymore. So, but
Well, it's a big mess, and these technologies, technology often evolves before the culture has, right?
right,
And especially communication technologies. I mean, when the printing press came in, like lots and lots of people tried to challenge the Catholic Church, but in general, the Catholic Church was able to either execute them, marginalize them, silence them, do whatever.
right,
The big difference was that Martin Luther happened to live near a printing press.
yeah.
And
Have you
and
ever
so within a go ahead.
have you ever listened to the Prophets of Doom on Dan Carlin's Hardcore History?
No, not I haven't listened to that one. I love Dan though.
It's
Good.
about Martin Luther in the
Mm-hmm.
anti-Baptist culture that
Mm-hmm.
took over Munster, Germany. Like, there was an
Mm-hmm.
anti-Baptist cult that completely took over the city, and the Catholic Church had to spend a couple of years trying to get rid of them.
Yep.
Uh, it goes into Martin Luther having access to a printing press and being protected by his community. But go
Yep.
ahead.
Well, but that's that's it, and I mean these technologies are incredibly disruptive. So within a few years, Martin Luther had flooded Europe with 3 million pamphlets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now the cat's out of the bag. Now you can't really shut this conversation down. And it's the same position that we're in with social media. I mean, this new technology has come in. The people who had power, who had control of the media, and sort of had the authority to speak, are suddenly like, what the fuck has happened?
Yeah.
And there's just this tremendous sort of explosion of activity, and all the sort of old norms are breaking down. And then, we have to sort through that and start to figure out, okay, what culture makes sense. But ultimately, Marshall McLuhan, who, is, I think, one of the most prescient individuals on all of this. Basically, he was the guy who talked about the medium is the message, right? Essentially, any technology of communication has baked into it a message. So if you have broadcast television, the message that's baked in is that there are authorities, they are on screen, they tell you what to think. Your job is to shut up and listen, right? And that's the culture of the 1950s. And then the culture of the internet is, hey, everybody gets a voice. And so what emerges from that is, this global village, and where we can't rely on sort of intuitions of authority, like, I have a PhD from blah, 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 and therefore you must listen to me, right? It really is much more peer-to-peer, and it really is much more, we all sort of hash out our differences. And so Katie O'Brien, who co-wrote The Straight Conspiracy with me, has this amazing analogy for this moment in history, which is it's humanity's first family dinner.
Oh, good. That's such a good analogy. I like that. I'm going to use that. I'll credit Katie.
Do. You can. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, is our goal is really to, create and hone and refine the stories and then disseminate them so that we all have the tools to have better conversations. Because obviously everybody knows the experience of a family dinner, right? It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. There's a whole bunch of elephants in the room that have not been addressed in decades.
Yeah.
And now we're fucking here, and we're at a table, and we kind of have to talk this shit out.
Yeah.
And that's really, I mean, the opportunity for all this technology is that we get a real community of people who are keen to turn Humanity's First Family Dinner in a more positive direction. And then we're essentially helping more and more people do that. We're like, Katie comes up with this great metaphor, right? We take that, she writes it up, we break that down, we then share it with the community, you pass it on. It's amazing. Like every single time I just say the words Humanity's First Family Dinner, everybody's like, "Oh, that is so good. I get it."
It is a good,
And
it's a good picture. Yeah.
yes, it is.
Now let's talk about the straight A conspiracy for a moment. Essentially, you wrote that book to help kids study better, right?
Well, what happened is we were tutoring all these kids, and then I would hear them say things like, "I didn't get the math gene." And I had majored in biochemistry, and I was like, "Math gene? You have a C in algebra." It's kind of, you can't just like look at your C and therefore like determine things about your genes. Like, it's a lot harder to figure out what a gene is. Like, blood has to be drawn, centrifuges are used, blocks are run, things are
thrown around.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of equipment that's required. So I was like, what the fuck is this shit? And then, Katie was focused, because she was coming from the humanities, was focused on a totally different thing. She was like, these kids are stressed out. They're fucking miserable. They hate school.
I remember the experience all too well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and the odd thing is that, I think the podcast community is funny in this regard and is a great demonstrator, where you have a lot of people who are like, in school, I fucking hate learning. They think that learning sucks. But then after school, they suddenly are like, Dan Carlin is amazing. I really enjoy listening to Joe Rogan. Bryan Callen is the greatest actor of all time.
Man, I graduated high school with a lofty, I think it was like a 2.7 GPA, crushing it academically. Later on in life, go on to create a podcast called The Deep Thinkers. Okay. Yep. There was obviously a shift somewhere that took place, but definitely, I can totally empathize with that. Being miserable in school, loving to learn when I'm interested in something, but being miserable in school, and then outside of school thinking, oh, paleoanthropology looks interesting. Why don't I start reading up on that? So, I definitely get that. Definitely.
Well, and the key thing is that it all comes down to emotions. So, humans are naturally curious. The chemical that is released when we learn is dopamine, which is the same chemical that is released in sex, eating delicious food, and then cocaine.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
So learning it is neurochemically addictive as shit.
Yeah.
Right? It really is. Like, anybody in the podcast community knows this. You like get a taste for it, and they're like, "Man, where's I need a new podcast episode."
Well, especially right now, this particular episode is totally evidence of that, because I reached out to you because I was like, dude, you said some really cool stuff. I want to hear more about that. Like, without the subject changing so fast, you got to come on my podcast so we can talk about it. So, but yeah, that makes total sense.
And so what ends up happening, though, is that there are a bunch of things that the school system fucks up in terms of being designed for humans. One, humanity's superpower. So there's a great graph from Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success, where they give an IQ test to a chimp, an orangutan, and a human toddler. Okay, well, I've got some bad news for the human species. On causal intelligence, figuring out why things happen, we are dumber than chimps. On spatial intelligence, we are dumber than chimps. On quantitative intelligence, basically numbers, math, and shit, we are dumber than chimps. So there's only one area in which we're smarter than chimps, and that is social intelligence. We're not
fingers off and stuff like that.
Well, we're able to learn from each other, and that is that cultural transmission, where essentially, you can, we constantly pick things up from each other, but the transmission mechanism for knowledge is social. Now, look at the structure of a typical high school classroom or middle school classroom. It's designed to prevent socialization.
Yeah, gotcha.
So you've literally structured the classroom to prevent human learning. And so what ends up happening is that, people hate that, they find it restrictive, they don't like that experience. On top of that, there's all of this evaluation that goes on where, I mean, there are a bunch of different, emotions that become core in this is, fear, right? So like there's a lot of fear of failure or, fear of embarrassment. And so fear is a terrible emotion for learning, right? Because fear literally shuts down your attention. I was so scared I couldn't think. So what will happen is a lot of kids will sit there in a math class or, in an English class, and they'll just be like freaked out the whole time. And they're literally not learning anything for the whole 45 minutes or hour. And then the other one is the feeling of stupid. So we say, I feel stupid for a reason, because stupid is the feeling of shame. And what shame causes you to do is to hide things, right? You're ashamed of it, so you try and put it away. And what students end up becoming ashamed of is their mistakes, their bad grades. But the problem is that learning requires taking your mistakes, looking at them, analyzing them, and then using them to improve. So you've created the exact wrong emotional context around mistakes, right?
Yeah.
What we should do is be curious about our mistakes. Oh, that one didn't work. I wonder why. Let's try and figure it out. Let's unpuzzle it. And now it becomes a fun puzzle to figure out.
Right.
So the emotional and the point is that you're not going to find a human who doesn't love to learn. They all love to learn. But the emotions that they have been trained to have around learning set them up to want to avoid it. And then there's literally a process of recovery that goes on post-school where people rediscover their joy of learning.
Yeah, I can identify with that for sure.
And I think a lot of people, I mean, especially, I mean, it's interesting, like, again, things that I've sort of come to realize about the podcast community. It's the community that gets that best, because it's a lot of people who didn't go to university necessarily, or, maybe they did, and they're just super intellectually curious.
I've got a couple semesters at Mesa Community College under my belt.
Congratulations.
I think I've got 3 semesters. Well, let's be honest. I've got 3 incomplete semesters at Mesa Community College. Yeah, I gave it a couple tries. It didn't work.
But but here's the thing: is that and this is sort of a lot of, I think, what is coming for the podcast community is that frankly, I got ripped off. Like you said at the beginning that I went to Harvard, and I got ripped off. And there's a story that I'll tell that I think sets this up pretty well. So my dad's family were doctors for generations and generations, and you're the local town doctor. You're good at your job. You build up some money over time.
Right.
So just before World War I, they had this. It was like, I think my great grandfather had this stack of cash, and he's like, I need to invest this. And so he goes to the best financial advisor, and he says, how can I invest this money? I'm not looking for any crazy return. I just want to keep it safe. And the guy says, well, you want to invest in the most stable, reliable thing you can. And he goes, what's that? He says, well, it's national bonds. And he goes, oh, okay. Which country should I invest in? And he says, you should invest in the oldest, most stable empires around. So that's the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire.
Oh.
And so he takes all his chips and he puts it on those 3 countries.
Poor guy.
And then World War I happens. And suddenly, overnight, even though he did the smartest, safest, most reasonable thing he could, it turns out to have been totally worthless. And for the decades, they kept all these bonds, all these worthless pieces of paper stacked up in the basement, until in World War II, they got so desperate, they had to burn it for kindling.
Wow. In poker, you call that a bet beat. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
the hand that should have somebody beats you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's rough.
And the point is that, I have repeated the mistakes of my ancestors, because I, played the hand that should have won in, 1999, 2000. Seemed really smart to go to Harvard. And you thought you were setting yourself up for financial success, all that sort of stuff. And then, essentially technology has now disrupted that. And now, at some point, I will burn my Harvard degree. And this is something that Thaddeus Russell and I have been talking about, is that once we start to get some real traction with all of this, we're going to have a little bonfire.
I would love to either be at that bonfire or listen to you and Thaddeus talk. I'm a fan of Thaddeus Russell. I think he's great.
Yeah.
Don't agree with everything he says, but and no one's going to agree with everything everyone says, but about 90% of what he says makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
When you agree with someone 90%, when you're talking with them, you just forget that other 10%. Don't even talk about it. Let's talk about the stuff we agree about. Let's talk about the stuff that I want to hear. Thaddeus Russell's podcast. I know he was a while back. He was talking about making one. Did he ever come through on that?
Yeah, unregistered.
Unregistered. Okay, cool. I'll have to check him out. Like I said, switch back and forth between podcasts and music all the time, and I'm usually a few months behind when I'm listening to podcasts.
Well, that's the challenge. Is there's so much content now, like you can't possibly keep up with it. And so, I mean, this is really the focus for Mixed Mental Arts is like, it's like, think about someone like Rogan. Rogan's had 1,000+ episodes now. Each one is more than 3 hours long.
Yeah,
that's 3,000+ hours of content. That is a lot.
Yeah. For that reason, I love Joe Rogan. I'd be lying if I said that his podcast didn't inspire mine a lot. But that's one reason I try to keep mine to below an hour and a half, is because 3 hours is a long time, man. And I feel like if someone's going to listen to my podcast, I want to give them time to listen to other podcasts too on their daily commute. But it's amazing because the podcast format is so open, and so you can just basically do whatever you want, and you don't have an executive breathing down your neck going, you say shit a little bit too much. Essentially, it's poop you're talking about. People don't want to hear that. No, man, it's just us. So.
Well, Chris Ryan and I are big fans of talking about poop. We talk about
Chris
poop
Ryan
as much
is so
as we
good.
can. So.
Yeah, Chris Ryan's another one, man. That guy, anytime he's on Rogan, I'm like, yes, I'm going to love this podcast.
Yeah.
His own podcast is great. And his delivery is so mellow. It's just, it's
He's
cool.
the dude.
Yeah, he is.
I mean, I know you're a priest of dudism, and I'm going to tell you that, I think that Chris Ryan is the actual dude.
Yeah, he's pretty close. He's pretty close. It would be interesting if Chris Ryan does not know about the Church of the Latter-day Dude, do me a favor and share the Dudism website with him, because I think he's in for a Dudist priest. So,
yeah. Which, by the way, is also an amazing band name for a Judas Priest cover band.
Oh yeah, the Dudist. Yeah, I actually had a stand-up bit about being a Dudist priest I was working on. I need to pick back up and dust off. But, man, I performed a couple weddings to date now because of it. I haven't done any funerals yet, but that's okay because, funerals are hard time. I don't do funerals well, man. I'll go and support people, but funerals are tough for me, man. So, for whatever reason. But I guess I am legally authorized to preside over them, even though I don't yet. Mm-hmm. But weddings are a lot of fun. So
well, there's a lot of emotional discomfort around death in general. And I mean, that's a lot of what Chris and I have been focusing on, is just like so much of our dysfunction culturally is around just accepting the fact that we are apes. And that we are mortal, and we do things like poop and die.
Yeah.
So
the Facebook group that I'm gathering around the Deep Thinkers podcast is actually called "Primates of Planet Earth Being Excellent to Each Other." So we're totally primates. Once you start to And once you start to realize that, weird little behavioral tics in humans all of a sudden aren't so weird. It's like, oh, that's a grooming thing, or
Hmm.
oh, that's whatever, But definitely primates. I love that bit that Joe Rogan has about our genome being 90%, 97% identical to chimpanzees. And then he says, if someone
Hmm.
offered you a sandwich that was 97% shit and 3% ham, would you call that a ham sandwich? Would you take a bite? It's like, fair enough. But
No.
going even further,
Yeah.
most people don't realize that we share 50% of our genome is identical to the banana. You know, it just,
Oh, really? Yeah,
oh
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it gives you an idea of just how vast, you know, genomes are. If we can
Yeah.
share 50% of our DNA with a banana, it's like, okay, just a lot of deep code in there. But um,
Yep.
I'm sorry, I cut you off, man. We were talking about Chris Ryan. What were we talking about? Are we good on time for you?
Yeah,
We're
I should probably duck out in a
okay.
minute, but
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I think all it was is that, so yeah, so the Straight A Conspiracy basically was, we wrote it as the book that we always wished we had in high school.
yes,
Um, because, and the one of the pleasant surprises is we wrote it for disgruntled high schoolers, but a lot of people who are in their 20s, 30s, and much older have really resonated with it, because it was what none of us got told in high school about how learning works. So
right,
everybody gets handed a brain, but nobody gets taught how to use it. And a lot of people end up thinking that learning isn't for them, because of the way that school is set up, and then come to realize much later, oh, fuck, actually, I like learning. And, to just sort of really take all of the mystery out of it and really empower people to do that. And that's incredibly important in the 21st century. There's a quote that I use on the podcast all the time that I'm very fond of, from Alvin Toffler, the futurist, who said, in the 21st century, the illiterate will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So the
that's solid.
effect of, yeah, all this changing technology means that we're constantly having to pivot, adjust, learn, unlearn, relearn. And so understanding how to teach yourself is really the core vital skill for the 21st century, and that's what the Straight A Conspiracy provides.
Excellent.
Um,
Is the Straight A
yeah,
Conspiracy? Is that in Barnes and Noble?
it might be. I
I'll
mean,
have
I
to
think
check
you
it out.
can get it, but
That,
it's certainly Amazon, Audible, Kindle.
that was going to be my
Um,
question. There is if it's on Audible. A lot of people, a lot
yep,
of my listeners will listen to books on tape when they're not listening to podcasts on their commute. So
yep.
I'm going to recommend that one to everybody. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but it's not because I don't want to. I definitely, since I heard you talk about it on that first Bryan Callen show about it, I think it was the one where his son burst into the room wanting his bow and arrow, and Bryan had to leave and go take care of business. And yeah, it's an old one when I first heard about that, but yeah, definitely looking
Yeah,
forward to reading it. Just man, I've got a hipster library that's huge, and I got an
yeah.
actual library that's small. And my hipster library is all the books I haven't read. It's
Hmm.
got Plato's Republic. It's got Hegemoneer's Survival. It's got all those good books. My hipster library is what I'm assembling as I work through that, or my actual library is what I'm assembling as I work through that. So I read that, put that on my actual library shelf. The Straight A Conspiracy is definitely in there. So I'm going to recommend all my listeners read it, even if I haven't had a chance to read it yet, because I have talked to people who have read it, and I've heard it's an excellent book. So, but
Well, I mean, we really just, I mean, that's been the great thing is, the number one piece of feedback is, this is, why didn't someone tell me this sooner? This
right,
is the book I wish I had in high school, and that's what we aim for. But the thing that you triggered for your hipster library that I was just quickly Googling is, there's a great Japanese word, tsundoku. And
Sudoku.
tsundoku is buying books and not reading them, letting books pile up unread on shelves or floors or nightstands. So it's literally the word for books that pile up with never getting read. So you
Everyone
have
does
your, yeah, everybody does it. But so tsundoku. But
that. All right.
I mean, and that's sort of the fun of, the cool thing about living in the 21st century is that there's this great cultural smorgasbord laid out before us where it's like we can go and like poke around Japanese culture and find the best bits of it and like borrow that and steal that, whether that's the food or the music or
The
the the jujitsu, right? I mean, literally, and that's what's cool is that cultural appropriation is fucking awesome.
yeah,
Like we should all.
I get a little bent out of shape over cultural appropriation. It's like, really, like you're getting upset because somebody else is thinking that a certain part of your culture is cool and they'd like
Yeah.
to borrow it.
Yep.
Essentially, you're getting angry at someone giving props to your culture in their own way.
Yeah. And it depends, it all depends on how it's done, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
so it's ultimately about, is it coming from that place that you're talking about of respect,
Right.
curiosity, interest, all of that sort of stuff. And, having traveled around a fair amount, like, when you come at things in that spirit, people are always very happy. They're happy to share their culture. They're happy that you respect and appreciate it. It's, really, it's not so much about cultural appropriation. It's about cultural disrespect. Or, and that's I understand that 100%.
That makes more sense using that
Yeah.
term like that.
Yeah.
So,
Scotch
Irish, there's
yeah.
there's probably a lot of things you could disrespect in the Scotch Irish culture that are just fine too. But yeah, Hunter.
But you better not disrespect the Scotch Irish culture because we all know what happens to people who mess with Texas.
Exactly.
Rough and ready.
Oh my gosh, Hunter, this has been a great podcast. I'm going to respect your time because I know it's short, and we're going to wrap this up. Before we do you have any sponsors or shout outs that you want to give to people?
The main thing that I would want to draw people's attention to is the Mixed Metal Arts Belt System, which is going to be coming out soon.
Excellent.
And in terms of respecting people's time, we just sort of really realized that, most people are not going to have the time to read these hundreds of books. And
Right.
so what we've been really focused on with, the mixed mental arts community, and lots of people have jumped in and helped volunteer, is to whittle down all of these books to 9 core principles.
Awesome.
And that's what the 9 belts are. And so our whole thing is to make it, there are 130 million books, 60 million scientific papers, countless hours of podcasts.
Yeah.
And we know that you don't have the time to consume all of that. No human does.
Right.
And so we're interested in really building a community that operates in the mental space the same way the mixed martial arts community, where we're all testing, probing, figuring out, and constantly refining better and better mental tools to help us navigate, the world and make sense of what's going on.
Very cool.
So
check that out.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about real quick.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that while you were, and it's gone.
No, it's there. It's there. It's there. Find it.
It's there. But in the meantime, while I'm looking for it, we've got to have you on again sometime because we were able to scratch the surface on a few of these topics, but there's other things I just kind of want to dive into. Oh yeah, okay. Okay. It came back to me. So while I have you here, before I let you go, real quick, what kind of music do you like to listen to? It's a weird question that I like to ask my guests because it gives you a little more insight of what people are all about.
I like bluegrass a lot.
Yes.
I also really like Sacred Harp.
Okay.
I think that's pretty amazing.
I'm not familiar with Sacred Harp.
Oh, Sacred Harp is awesome, dude. Like, that is some powerful shit. So it's basically shape note singing. Basically, they were trying to figure out how to spread and popularize music and just make it easier for people to learn it.
Okay.
So they actually did it with shapes representing the different notes.
Okay. Cool.
And then what happens is that Sacred Harp singing, you break up the choir into the 4 parts, and they all stand on sides of a square. And then in the middle is the conductor, and the conductor literally is just going like this to beat time. It's the simplest conducting in the world. But you get these amazing, amazing harmonies, and I can't recommend it enough. It's very cool.
Now, is there music involved in it, or is that just a term for it?
No, it's straight vocals, nothing
Acapella.
else.
Okay, cool.
And I like, let's see. I mean, I like a weird eclectic mix of stuff. I have a weakness for bubblegum pop, like shitty pop music.
You know, I have a
Um,
weakness for 80s shitty pop music
oh, I
because of my
love 80s.
sisters growing
Yeah,
up, man. So I was a
yeah.
promoter for 7 years in Salt Lake. I did, 4 to 6 shows a week, um,
Hmm.
mostly top 40 music, but I was exposed to all kinds of music. So I always kind of like to throw that question out there just to kind of give my listeners an idea of kind of humanize my guests a little more, just so that they're not like a talking head on the podcast. They actually have a little bit more deep personality too. Um, yeah, the only thing that came to mind when you said Sacred Harp was there's a cover band called Harptalica that actually does all Metallica covers.
Oh, really? That's amazing.
Yeah, so that's where my mind was going there. But it sounds like Sacred
Yeah.
Harp is something a full new genre that I'm going to have to check out for sure. So
Yeah, it's really really awesome, and it just in general I tend to like music that is sort of like much more sort of simple, stripped down, raw, primal. Like that's the stuff I really resonate with. Tuvan throat singing, I think is fucking
gotcha.
epic.
There's a
Um,
there's a band you might like, a local band out of Salt Lake called Sev versus Evan,
oh,
and basically what they've done is they had to be huge 8-bit Nintendo graphics fans because it's really good music, but a lot of it is that Super Mario type do 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 do
yeah,
do.
yeah, yeah.
It's great music, but check them out. You may like them. Sev versus Evan. So
Done, done.
all right, brother. Hunter, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a long time putting this one together. The wait was totally worth it. I look forward to doing it again. Thank you for your time and your unique insight. And Planet Earth, as we sign off, please remember, above all, be excellent to each other
And party on, dudes.
and party on, dudes. Yeah, man, I love that movie. But I actually, while we're talking about that, I introduced my nephew yesterday to E.T. He's
Oh
5.
shit.
Oh man, that movie's so, I forgot how much I loved that movie. And as I'm watching it, you got the bike ride scene, you've got
Hmm.
so many different cool scenes that kids love, and it all came together. And then John Williams just nails it with the score. But
Hmm.
I love the line, "Swear to me, the most excellent promise you can make." Like twice in that movie, and I was just like, yes, I'm gonna have to use that on the
Yeah.
podcast. So, but thank you again for coming on, sir. I appreciate it, man.
All right, I'll talk to you soon, Jesse.
All right, you have a great one, Hunter.